I will, Zoom has this new feature where it tells you it's recording, which we're grateful to be able to do so that we can share with those who couldn't join us this evening. Thank you for joining us. I am thrilled to introduce our dynamic racial justice committee. This panel is really a labor of their hard work and love. And I will, in a moment, turn it over to them. This evening is the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death. And as we gather this evening to bear witness, it marks a moment on this ongoing journey. That was the moment that galvanized this chapter of social justice and racial justice work at Temple Beth El. Out of it has come an extraordinary group working together. It is really that I turn it over to them. I want to recognize our co-sponsors this evening. We're grateful to be joined by Stephanie Haig from the Jewish Alliance. This program is co-sponsored by the Board of Rabbis, JCDSRI, Congregation Beth Shalom, and Mitzvah Matzah. All of us together across the Jewish community are grateful to be in this space, this holy space, this sacred space, to have this conversation. And with that, I turn it over to Diana Fox, who is one of the co-chairs of our Racial Justice Committee.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and welcome to all to the first part of our 3-part series on Black Lives Matter in our congregations and communities, titled Black Lives Matter and Jewish Community Obligations, Allyship with Not Free to Desist. I'm Diana Fox, and I'm joined by my Temple Beth El Racial Justice Committee co-chairs and co-hosts of this event, Carlene Leite Fiorito and Wendy Grossman. We're honored to welcome our 3 panelists, whom I will introduce briefly. Fuller details are on the Temple Beth El website, and we would love it if the panelists would share links to their websites in the chat. Also, please put your questions in the chat, which Wendy and Carlene will monitor, and we will save Q&A till the end. With us, we have today Marco McWilliams, Associate Director of Education and Training at the Center for Reconciliation. Marco is a founding director of the Black Studies program at DARE and an organizer with Behind the Walls, DARE's Prison Abolition Committee. He's the founder of the Providence Black Studies Freedom School, a free political education project focused on providing theoretically grounded and engaged historical instruction for members of Providence's diverse communities. He will begin by offering us an overview of the history of Black Lives Matter and Black liberation movements with his talk, Where Do We Go From Here? Bending the Arc of Black Liberation. Yolanda Savage Narva currently leads the Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion work for the Union of Reform Judaism. She is also a member of the Juvie Nation cohort, a fellowship sponsored by the Union for Reform Judaism. She's a 2019 Schulsterman Fellow, a Vice Chair of the Religious Action Center's Commission on Social Action, and a co-chair of the Racial Justice Equity Committee for the RAC. Her talk is entitled Addressing the Binary, Black Lives Matter and Dismantling All Systems of Oppression. Louis R. Gordon is professor and head of the philosophy department at UConn Storrs, where he also has affiliations in Judaic Studies, Caribbean and Latinx Studies, Asian and Asian American Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Global Studies. He's an Afro-Jewish philosopher, political thinker, educator, and musician who grew up in the Bronx, New York. His research in philosophy is in Africana philosophy, existentialism, phenomenology, social and political philosophy, and philosophy of human sciences. His talk is titled Praxis of Radical Love in Response to Hate, an Afro-Jewish interpretation of Black Lives Matter. After our 3 panelists give their presentations, we will open it up for Q&A and then have some closing remarks. Thank you all for joining us, and Marco, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you all. It's an honor and pleasure to be here. Break bread with y'all. Looking forward to the next hour, some robust and uninhibited dialogue. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge my colleague and friend, Betsy Schimberg, in the space right now. Betsy Schimberg is from day one, always looking out for me over there, Brown. Appreciate you, love you for that. I thought that I would open up with a moment of taking us back in order to situate us in this current context of Black Lives Matter. And we, I'm sure, remember the moment in Chicago with Emmett Till's funeral. His mother is pressed by the Chicago police chief, have a closed casket. She rebuffs. She says, no, I want to let the world see what happened to my baby. In this act, there's a way in which she's pushing back against the power, the silencing of Black death. We live in a context now in a world of social media where information moves in real time, like as it happens. Everybody's got an electronic device in their pocket, in their purse. And had we been in 1955 at the funeral, that was the equivalent of a viral moment. And many scholars have talked about that as a beginning point for the modern civil rights movement at that time. Scholars have also talked about the technology of Americans increasingly having television sets in their homes so that they see the visual images of the police dogs being put on protesters. So it's not a newspaper, it's not that something they just hear through a radio broadcast. And in my opening, I might just submit to us tonight that America had one of those moments in real time with the officer's knee on George Floyd's neck. And what is that moment? It's a moment that reminded us, Black, White, or Candy Stripe, it reminded us all of something. A public lynching. See, this wasn't a video that came out after the fact, right? Nobody had to, you know, in my organizing background in the Providence community, sometimes when we want information from a certain place, we have to issue a FOIA request, right? Freedom of information, we need to see that. It didn't happen this way. They saw it. There was a live audience, people screaming. He's not moving. He yells a tragic refrain that we all knew. It's on t-shirts. I can't breathe. But something else happened. Something else happened that impacts a particular segment of our society in a particular kind of way. What does George Floyd do? He calls out for his deceased mother. Every mother, regardless of race, regardless of class, every mother was able to walk through that path that George Floyd creates. You know, I love going on Facebook, and Betsy always posts pictures of her son, and he's hiking the Appalachian Trail. I didn't know that the young man was hiking the whole thing. I thought he was just going to one side of the mountain and coming back down. She said, no, he's doing the whole thing. Like that's phenomenal. Betsy's a mother. Mothers all around the country heard that, and they heard George Floyd in that particular moment. I'm hoping that tonight we can have a conversation around this question of racial justice, of white supremacy, of anti-Black violence that requires us to hear in a different way. To hear with the ear tuned to history. Because this didn't just come from out of nowhere. And if you're, I keep pulling my friend Betsy in this because we both work in higher education. If you work on a college campus, if you work in higher ed, Brother Gordon here, students are showing up on the campus now and they're singing a different tune. They want structural change. And because of the power of social media, they know how to make it viral themselves. So they're not asking questions anymore. They're coming with demands. And I think it's up to all of us to know how to respond to that so that we don't get caught on the wrong side of history. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Let's now pass it to Yolanda, keeping in mind your historical framework for the present moment.
I needed to take a deep breath. Marco, thank you for framing. It's really an honor to share this space with you and Lewis tonight. And I want to thank Carlene, Diana, and Wendy for putting this together and for recognizing the importance of seizing this moment right now. Before I start, I would like to share a poem with all of you that I wrote Juneteenth of last year when I spoke to my synagogue, Temple Micah, here in Washington, D.C. And it's called Dear Freedom. Dear Freedom, why is the word free a part of your name? Because obtaining freedom surely hasn't been free. I and so many others have been looking and waiting for you for such a long time, and we have prepared a space for you to stay. Do you want to know how long we've been waiting for you? Over 400 years, to be exact. No, I'm not angry with you. I know why you haven't yet arrived, but I am growing weary, exhausted. But if you think you'll actually show up this time, I think I can muster the strength to help you get here. I know that you've been trying to get here for a long time, but a few things have gotten in your way. But in spite of these obstacles, you fill the car with gas, you get the oil checked, check the tire pressure, get a good night's rest, and begin your journey over and over again with numerous incidents of either being sidetracked or stopped dead in your tracks. How do you do it? How do you keep starting over? I'm surprised you still have any desire, any fight left in you to even try. But you must really, really want to be here because nothing has turned you away. Your ability to persevere and pivot and be powerful is impressive. Your resiliency is awe-inspiring. Thank you for never giving up and for pushing ahead. And I promise I will do all that I can help to do to get you here. I would also like to pause for a moment of silence for George Floyd's memory and hope that his memory will be for a blessing. So as we have entered the year 5781, I can only think about the past year, the past 16 months as a challenging, unpredictable series of events that has altered the way we live and the way we continue to exist on this earth. We continue to live with a global pandemic that impacts all of us, but disproportionately affects Black and Brown communities due to the centuries of health abuses and inequities. Last year, we saw on full display to the entire world the brutality, the dehumanization, and murders of unarmed Black people at the hands of those who for so long have willed power in this country. While exposing the ongoing systemic inequities for Black and Brown folks in education, economics, housing, the criminal justice system, and many, many other systems. And this is all happening under the umbrella of the biggest climate crisis in the history of mankind. And last year, one of the most historic elections of our time. Thinking about some of the things that have happened throughout history, and Marco talked about this at the opening of his presentation. The first thing that crossed my mind is Emmett Till, who was lynched when visiting the South because he was accused of whistling at a white woman who later said it wasn't true. He was 14 years old. One of the reasons this hits home for me is because I'm a native of Mississippi. And I grew up after the civil rights movement, but understanding how something like this can happen. Black Americans are 82% more likely to be hit and killed by drivers than white Americans, according to a report from Smart Growth America, where we've put the highest speed highways or arterials right through Black and Brown communities. A new survey from the Atlantic and the Public Religion Research Institute shows that Black and Hispanic citizens are more likely than whites to face barriers at the polls and to fear the future erosion of their basic political rights. In the United States, the CDC reported that Black women experience maternal mortality at a rate 2 to 3 times higher than that of white women. Pre-existing disparities in access to adequate internet connections and computer technology are being exacerbated by a shift to remote learning that disproportionately affects Black children. According to Newsweek, of the 966 police killings reported since May 25th of 2020, the database shows that Black people account for 18.7%, despite making up only 13% of the US population. And finally, academic researchers found racial and economic disparities in the distribution of fine particle pollution. Nationwide, Black and low-income people face the highest risk for death from power plants, fine particle pollution, according to new research. And this pollution likewise causes thousands of deaths across state lines. And so this only touches the surface of the inequities, the systemic racism and oppression that has plagued the Black and Brown community for centuries. And so I want to frame my thoughts with you tonight, looking at the Marshall Ganz storytelling narrative. And he actually defines storytelling in 3 pillars. One is the story of self. Who are we? Who are we? What is our story? What do we bring to this moment? What is the story of us? What is the story of now? And then I've added another one that is called the story of there. So briefly, the story of me. I was born to Black parents. One grew up in the Deep South in Mississippi at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, and another parent grew up in the ghettos of Chicago, Illinois. Different backgrounds, but very similar traumas and challenges. And what did they teach me? They taught me to make sure that I didn't think that I was better than anyone else, and no one else is better than you. To meet people where they are in their journey, be the captain of your own ship, and then find 4 things that do this to be successful in life: sustains you, challenges you, motivates you, and inspires you. Story of self. What is the story of us? And this is specifically in the context of the United States. I'm going back a little bit. 1492, Columbus discovered America. By the 1900s, 80% of the indigenous community had been wiped out at that point. Simultaneously, enslaved Africans were being brought over to the United States. Some say as early as the early 1500s, but what we have documented are the 20 enslaved Africans who came to Jamestown in 1619. We have the Reconstruction era of 1863 through 1877. We have Black codes that actually started in Mississippi. They kicked it off, of course, 1865 through 1866. And then Jim Crow started immediately afterwards. And then, of course, we have the Civil Rights Movement. That's 1953, 54 through 1968. Those dates are definitely, earlier and later than those dates. And so that leads me to talking a little bit about the title of my presentation, which is around the binary piece and the Civil Rights Movement. And for a lot of people, the Civil Rights Movement was one of the most public and well-known examples of a partnership between the Black, Christian, and some Muslims and the white Jewish community. And so thinking about this time period, one of the images that comes to mind is the image of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And I know that we think about this time period as a pivotal point in Black and Jewish relations. And so when I think about the pillar of the Civil Rights Movement and Black Lives Matter movement, there are a couple of things that I think is really important to pull out from that time period. And that is that the Civil Rights Movement, while it was very important to our history, shouldn't be seen as a binary when we think about the Black Lives Matter movement. And so when we think about the Black Lives Matter movement, we have to be very tuned in to Black lives that are internal to the Jewish community as well as external to the Jewish community. And so one of the things that's really important to think about with Black lives is that if Black lives, after the 400 years of systemic oppression and racism, don't matter, it is going to be very difficult to be able to solve and deal with any other oppressions that people are experiencing. That's trans lives, that's people with disabilities, that's people from all backgrounds, that's people who are experiencing religious discrimination. So Black Lives Matter is the pillar of that. And it is that way because of the hierarchy of the white dominant culture that has been created over centuries. And so I want to make sure that when we have an opportunity to have our Q&A, that we ground ourselves in that reality, that supporting Black Lives Matter is urgent for all of our futures. And so to end, I want to share an excerpt with you from the Talmud, from Mishnah Sanhedrin, chapter 4, verse 5, that says this: in the Talmud, we learn that all people are descendants from a single person, so that no person can say, My ancestor is greater than yours. God created humanity from the four corners of the earth, yellow clay and white sand, black loam and red soil. Therefore, the earth can declare to no part of humanity that it does not belong here, that this soil is not their rightful home. So a couple of questions for us to think about. What's next for us as a Jewish community, as a community connected to humanity? What's our call to action? And how do we make sure that we do the work of what I call mirrors and windows, where we do the internal work as well as the external work? And finally, I have to share this quote with you because it's my favorite quote, and I think it is really indicative of the time that we're in. And it's by the late, beautiful, powerful Dr. Maya Angelou. And she was responding to a question in 1973 by Bill Moyer. She was on an interview and he asked her, how does she view being a part of the community? And here's her response. You are only free when you belong no place. You belong every place, no place at all. The price is high, but the reward is great.
Many thanks, Yolanda. There's so much richness there, so many layers to unpack and to think about. Let's add some more. Louis, welcome.
Thank you. I begin by saying Wanakisuk. And one of the reasons I say Wanakisuk is because that's Wampanoag for hello or welcome. Of course, it has an unfortunate element to it because, as we know, the Wampanoag were those who greeted and protected and treated well the pilgrims. And in return for that generosity, we know what happened to the Wampanoag. I also add Hotep, which means peace. It's in the language Medineter, the ancient language of the people of Kemet, the people you know today as ancient Egyptians. And it's interesting because, as we know, there's already something afoot when you have to say, when you greet someone, peace, because it means that you're in a context in which you faced war. As we know, in Hebrew, we say shalom. But not every language will say peace. There are other languages, for instance, among the Zulu, where they would say sawubona. And sawubona means something a little different. It means, I see you. We forget sometimes that to be seen shouldn't be a moment of dread. If you're in the wilderness, you're vulnerable, you're alone. It's such a welcome sight for another human being to look at you and say, I see you. But in a world or in a society that's governed by hate, to be seen has the veneer of being caught, to be under surveillance. And those are some of the elements that are at work with what's going on when we begin to speak about or the question of racial justice. Now, it'll take some time to get through even the racial part here, because this context here, we've already inherited a way of talking about this question in Jewish contexts that simultaneously misrepresent the issues and also misrepresent Jewish history and Jewish people. And you may say, what do I mean? Well, we know it's not like today, if we're talking about at least European Jews, that European Jews have come to realize racism. And the reason I could say this is because, and again, I'll have to keep it short, but the concept of race as we understand it came out of an historical circumstance that was asserting an attitude specifically against Jews and Afro-Muslims that led to the creation of the term reza. And that's because, and we forget that there was a time when there was a form of theological naturalism that said to be natural was to be Christian, and to be outside of that framework was to be outside of the eyes of the Christian God, which meant that Afro-Muslim people, Muslims generally, and Jewish people were outside of the natural. And this tag of race, as we know, led to a history of racism that had many horrific exemplars, not only in the Inquisition, but also, if we tell the Jewish story, in Shoah or the Holocaust. But as I said, it was a symbiotic connection with the question of African Muslims and many African Jews. And the process of how this unfolded over history took very complex forms that affected how Jewish people and also many people of African descent understand our histories, which is rather unusual because Yolanda and I are the convergence of the two. In my case, it's Mizrahi and Sephardic. But the thing here is that I'm going to make some pointers that way we could come to the discussion. The first pointer is to bear in mind that racism is a practice and an organization of power of dehumanization. And dehumanization requires disempowerment. Because you see, when we talk about power, in the good sense of power, not the negative sense, the good sense of power is what a human community can create to lead to a reduction of powerlessness among people. Okay? That example when I said, I see you, is one of empowerment. Disempowerment is the use of power to block people's capacity to flourish and to grow. And that's the form of force that has been historically how racism, misogyny, settler colonialism, because I opened with the Wampanoag, and many other examples of misanthropy could be understood. But you see, if you're going to spend all your time trying to hold and force people, you could see right now when we talk about the police, for instance, look at how much funding is being used to support the idea that people are under perpetual threat. It's far more effective, actually, to make people police themselves. And this was one of the things, one of the most effective ways, anybody knows this, of curtailing the empowerment of people is manipulation. This is why all forms of dehumanization depend upon lies. In other words, it's to erase people's history, it's to erase people's sense of their agency, it's to make them believe that they cannot make a difference in their actions. So some of the pointers I will begin with, one of them, it's rather interesting because I always quip that, you know, if you use the term blacks and you use the term Jews, you just use two terms on which everybody has an opinion. But few people know what the hell they're talking about. Okay? And it's always striking to me how many Jews don't really know Jewish history, and how many blacks, or if you put it together, Black Jews don't know our history. You know, the first recorded Jew in the colonies was arrested for working on the Christian Sabbath. And he was arrested because he was listed as a mulatto. His name was Solomon. And he explained in his trial, boy, this history of dealing with the police goes way back, huh? He said in his trial, it's not my Sabbath. He said, I'm a Jew. I bring this up, of course, because you see, this question of how violence and law plays a role in how we can understand these issues have a long history, but they also have a history of erasure. Because you see, many of us today don't even realize that it was very recent that any Jew, regardless of complexion, would be called white. That's a very recent historical development. Okay? If you look at all the European racist literature, Jews are referred to as either mulattoes or black or brown. And when I say this, of course, it's difficult for some people to understand because Black families are complicated. Many Black families can look exactly like the screen right now, even if they're not Jewish Black families. So when I talk about Jews in this way, I'm not talking about morphology. So as I tell this story, we have to understand that we're telling a story of a convergence of several stories. One is a story that actually began with what is now the fundamental metaphor of our times, I cannot breathe. When we think of those people kidnapped and brought across the Middle Passage, because you can't breathe in the hull of those ships. And the whole effort of disempowerment has mechanisms of technologies of asphyxiation. Lynching breaks your neck. 40% of lynchings, for instance, a lot of people don't realize this, were done on Black women and children. But also, as we know, before recent whiteness, the categories of the non-whites who were lynched included Greeks, Italians, Irish, quite a few others. But the mechanisms of situations like policing, that was specifically targeted toward, in the context of the United States, Black people. And so, as I tell the story, I'm going to go to another marker to try to get to the title of what I'm talking about. Because to understand hate in the way I'm talking about hate, I've already begun with the practice of disempowerment. But you may ask, why in the world would you want to disempower another human being? Well, it would make sense if you understand, it's one thing to talk about exploitation, colonialism, and those things. But to understand hate, though, that passion, hate is an outward direction of aggression to evade a displeasing truth about the self. And think about that self. Because imagine if you're raising a child and you say to that child, you are superior. You deserve everything. If you don't get what you want, there's something wrong with the world. I just described white supremacy. But everyone in this audience who's a parent knows that if you were to say to any child those things, you will be creating the most obnoxious child. Because the mentality would be that somehow that child must be superior. And you would have to now create a whole world of lies to fit that child's perception of the self you have bestowed on that child. This is one of the fundamental elements of racial injustice. Because you see, racial injustice moves from the realm of what we could even call privileges. Because you see, privileges can be good. I have the privilege of speaking with you right now. There are many privileges that we could have. But nobody rightfully has a privilege to kill, rape, torture, maim. That's not properly privilege. There you're in the realm of license. You see, a license means you're the exception to every rule. You can get away with it. And this is how we can have a history in which for a long time, the lynchings like what we witnessed with George Floyd, or what people are now witnessing as the body cams come out with Ronald Green in Louisiana, that was actually a norm of the society, because the presumption was that there was a population of people who had the right even to do those things. You see? Now I bring this up because you see, there are several things to bear in mind when we think about these examples. If we think in the civil rights struggle, for instance, when James Earl Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Henry Schwerner were killed, when the FBI went in to look for those two, because at that point the transition came into whiteness, when they were to looking for those two whites, they were told to look in the swamps. But you know what they found over and over in those swamps? Many Black corpses. And this tells you something, because all those dead Black people were in the realm of anonymity. The statement was that their lives didn't matter. So as we now begin to shift, what is it that's going on with this shift? Well, to understand this shift, I'm going to briefly and conclude with two things to consider. The first one is the ethical. As we know, we have a conception in Judaism. A lot of people who are not Jewish are shocked to find out that in many Jewish communities, you don't have to believe there is a God. You're just obligated to be ethical. Because part of being Jewish, exemplified in carrying Torah, is to take on the responsibility for ethical life. But you see, some people distort that responsibility, because some people think when you look at racial injustice, you now have to rewrite it to say if they could do that to Blacks, let's imagine it's not right, then they could do it to us. But in there is a sneaking in of a kind of Jewish whiteness. You see, the thing to say, if you think ethically, is not if they could do that, they could do that to us. It's that they shouldn't be doing that at all. And we have an obligation to fight it, even if it will never happen to the proverbial us. But if you go back to what I talked about with power, when I talked about disempowerment, racism is not simply a matter of ethical responsibility. It's a matter of political responsibility. Because you see, ethical responsibility makes you ask how it affects me. What am I to do? But political responsibility is always, always about us. And the us in political responsibility is radically inclusive. Because when you act politically, it ultimately will affect people you will never meet, people you will never know. So, why then do I say practice of radical love in response to hate? Well, you see, many of us have been handed a pleasing falsehood. The pleasing falsehood, and in a lot of my writings, I talk about racism as a form of, evasion of reality for pleasing falsehoods. The pleasing falsehood is to believe that you could only love those who are like yourself. I call that narcissistic love. And white supremacy and all racisms actually are premised upon narcissism. Could you imagine? I love you. Why? Because you're like me. But the problem with that model is it doesn't capture something else. And although Judaism has all kinds of complicated issues, there is something fundamental about the injunction against idolatry. The idea that we say Hashem, you're not to name God. The reason is you would make an idol, but that is the narcissistic reproduction of the self. So now let's get into this other example. What's extraordinary is the idea that if you eliminate reproduction of the self, how is it possible still to love? I tell a story sometimes about Black women and men who were enslaved, indigenous people like the Wampanoag, what they faced. Or if we think about those people who are going through the Inquisition, or people, some of them I know growing up in the Bronx, who are in Auschwitz. And one of the things that's extraordinary is that they all experienced a world that said they didn't matter. It's a world that not only said they didn't matter, it also said the love they had to offer humanity lacked value. Yet they acted. How was it possible for those people to act with no expectation, expectation at all that it would lead to a reproduction of themselves? I call that radical love. I write about it with Frederick Douglass's mother, Harriet Bailey, because she only got to see her child when he was born, and then for 6 months when he was 7, and then she died because she worked as a field slave. But her effort to reach that child instilled with him the understanding that he was more valuable than simply a commodity for a master. But I always point out that the real issue isn't whether he saw himself as valuable, but whether he could value being loved by a woman. Everybody around him, every resource told him that her love was not valuable. When Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and the women of Black Lives Matter, when Alicia Garza, who by the way is Jewish, a lot of people don't realize this, when she tweeted Black Lives Matter, she later said it was a love letter, because she was saying, although there's a world that tells you you're not valuable, I'm offering you a love to remind you that you're valuable. But here's the point. There's a lot of the world that wants us to reject that love, to reject the love that says Black Lives Matter, to reject the love that comes from these Black queer women. But the radicality of that love shine through, because you see, what Black Lives Matter is about is not the narcissistic love of the reproduction of the self is the understanding that if you're going to fight for empowerment, you have to radicalize the value of the people. Black Lives Matter is a fight for democracy. And it's no accident that the agents against democracy have targeted Black Lives Matter as an enemy. So what's crucial here, if we're fighting for what's right, is we face a moment now where we look and ask ourselves, when we act, are we acting out of a commitment for what matters? And the answer at that point is already reaching through, because you see, in the history of a lot of the times people took to the streets around racial issues, the mantra of those who have a stake in it, European Jews, there were a lot of Black Jews, but they were erased in the discourse. That was different last year because a lot of those whites were not Jewish. A lot of those folks right now who have gone through the cutting down of connectedness have now had to look at a screen, not simply as an object on display, but as we are all doing now, as a desperate understanding of communication through which we understand we need each other for our humanity. And so Black Lives Matter, yeah, because ultimately, like all examples of ethical and political responsibility, it's always, always about fighting for and reaching out for something greater than ourselves. It's not about me. It's not about you. It's always, always about us. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. How to follow that with a question. There aren't any questions in the chat. I do have a few points to reflect on, and I'm afraid that Marco had to run. He was called in to teach last minute for somebody who couldn't be there. I would like to open up our discussion, turning to Yolanda's question that she posed for us about what is next for us, thinking of us in that broad intersectional way that you framed, Louis, starting with the Wampanoag sense of place and the intertwined histories that we share without often even knowing it. What is next for us, thinking of our political and ethical responsibilities, in also thinking about what's next, exploding the binary between the internal and external work, that binary that you posed, Yolanda. The internal is not just the in-group, but the internal dialogue with self that these wonderful talks lead us to reflect upon in terms of positioning ourselves in this complex history. So if you could reflect, starting with Yolanda, on that idea of what's next with our, and turning it a little bit to the practical, because political and ethical responsibility demands that we take these very deep and historical ideas and transform them into action. Could you begin reflections of that, please, for us, and then
I would love to. Sorry about the echo. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about recently is this concept of time. And I would say maybe a month ago, one of my rabbis talked about time in a very different way. And it made me really start thinking about why are we here and what is our purpose? And he framed time in a way that focused on the past and the future. And not that I'm going to get to the present. The present is important, but the pillars are the past and the future. And basically, what it made me think about is learning and understanding the past in a way that we seize the opportunity to turn the trauma and the pain into power. And we use the present moment and the urgency around that moment to not focus on a series of right nows, but to actually ground ourselves in a way that we are setting things in motion for the future, for our descendants. And so, thinking about what's next for us, in a sense, is seizing this moment, not for ourselves, but for others. And Lewis talked about that. And I am really in tune with that because I've been thinking a lot about what I'm doing right now, and 20 minutes will be part of the past. What part of right now is going to actually make things better for the future? And I think if we start thinking around these concepts of time, not focused on ourselves and what we gain from it and what we might accomplish for ourselves, but what we're actually doing for our descendants, because our ancestors have done that for us. And that's why we are here in the space that we're in right now. And so we have to be forward thinking and thinking ahead, and how we are actually influencing what happens to generations to come.
Absolutely, and that's actually links again to the deep past and the Iroquois Confederacy's notion of the 7 generations forward, and we're all together on the planet facing a climate crisis that is particularly affects those who are the most vulnerable. So the thinking of the us in the long term is also important for the planetary survival in this broad sense. Lewis?
Yeah, there are several things that immediately come to mind. The first thing is, there are many people sometimes they say, we ought to do X, but then they do this. They're always looking for somebody else to do it. But as we know, we have some great metaphors in biblical stories, but not only biblical ones, in many other societies and cultures to have a story. The person who runs away from the calling. Because as we know, the question of responsibility often requires ultimately challenges that really could lead to a lot of suffering. There are several things. The first thing is we need to renew our understanding of what social power is. Institutions, just for instance, right now, we are in a relationship of power because you see, every time human beings gather is a moment of power. And when we do it, we can create institutions that can build positive power. So for instance, one could build a shul, a temple, a synagogue. One could build a community center. One could build an ongoing meeting. There are many things. But here's the thing. No one knows in advance what they're going to produce. The other day I was, one of the things when you grow up in New York is, you don't realize it until you finally get around trees, how beautiful and wonderful trees are. And I love trees. The other thing I know about trees, especially when I lived in Providence, because I lived actually in Roger Williams Park, at a house there. I got to know a lot of the trees, and trees are really vibrant, living, social creatures. So the other day, right around where I live, there are these vines. There's this vicious vine. I call it the vampire vine, that goes up and strangles a lot of the trees. It sucks away their nutrients. And the trees around, I was like, oh my, these trees look like they're dying. So I took out a cutting device. I call it the Tony Soprano. Okay. And so I went to Tony Soprano on those vines. But I just thought, I don't know if these trees will survive, but let me cut just maybe they could just have a little air I mean, these were trees that were literally, they were being strangled. And I thought, who knows, you know? I was shocked that suddenly within days, there was this beautiful, vibrant life. These trees were growing. I had no way to know this. I could have looked at it and said, look, you know, they're dead. They're a lost cause. Now, of course, I'm telling a metaphor. What I found is in the long list of political institutions with which I've worked and the struggles in which I've been involved, there was no way to know the outcomes in advance. That's why I focused on commitment and creativity. You see, and there are other things we need to ask when we're doing it. You see, one of the things that I lament is the impact, for instance, of what neoconservatism has had on many Jewish communities. Most Jews are not neoconservative, but the history of non-religious Jews is a rather interesting, vibrant history, because many of them were involved in anti-racist struggles. They were among those who were bringing the United States up on charges of genocide in the 40s. They were among, and the list, and they never went away. And why I'm bringing this up is that in the discourse of the present, those people are invisible. But they weren't fighting for visibility. They were fighting for what is right. And when I say this, there are lots of practical things we can do. But now we're getting into a different kind of framework, because we're really talking about something that the right-wing types hate, which is the word liberation. And it's really shocking, the idea that there are Jews who are against liberation. Because if we know, when you're in Pesach, what's Pesach about? I mean, Passover, right? What is the Seder about? It's a story of liberation. But what's beautiful about these stories, and also tragic about many of them as well, is that they always remind us that you don't have a guarantee when you're trying to fight for what is right. I mean, look at what happened to Miriam. Look at what happened to Moses. You know what I'm saying? For the I don't know if they're but for the non-Jews who are looking to the story, they didn't get in the promised land. Okay. But I see that as the real point. There's a lot for us to do, and it requires a lot of courage for many of us. Right now, for instance, there are a lot of people trying to speak for all of us. There are a lot of times I have to deal with Jews who are invisible, whether they're in Kaifeng, whether they're Koshin Jews, whether they're Lemba Jews, most people can only know 2 or 3 types of Jews. I could name more than 150 kinds. And part of this is, well, it helps being a professor who studies them. But the other part is I go and meet the people. And I bring this up because I think every step, ultimately the fundamental condition of change requires communication, not simply speech communication in the sense of oral speech or written speech, but every action, every march, every communicative act, that communication brings us together in a way that opens the door for possibilities. And they're not, and every institution we have, from our places of worship in cases, to our places of work in others, to others simply our places of play, all of them are intertwined. And the problem is the details. There are a lot of details I could give, but the short version I could say is renew the understanding of liberation, but also think about what it is to be political as an act of increasing the options available for people to live meaningful lives. Okay? In other words, when you open a door, that's an option. When you create conditions where people could eat, that's an option. When you create conditions where people can move with safety, that's an option. And when you refuse to be a bystander, but actually be actively involved in the change, right? Those are political. And get rid of this crap that says we're to separate the worlds of, say, religion or knowledge and politics. Because look, we're meeting in a context where the history was an ongoing conflict between prophets and kings. If that isn't political, I don't know what isn't. Okay, what is? So lots.
Yes, there's a lot of work to do for sure. Reminds me of an Ashanti proverb: "Let not what you cannot do tear from your hands what you can." Beginning with one foot. Wendy or Carlene, I'd like to invite you both. Our time is short, but we do have some really interesting comments and questions in the chat.
Carlene asked me to read the first one, so I
Okay.
will. The first question is, how do we decenter whiteness in Judaism to amplify, and they write, BIPOC narratives, then extend it outside of Judaism to practice anti-racism in Jewish life?
Could we hear all the questions if you don't mind? That way, since it's recorded, even if we don't get to answer them, there'll be food for thought for the audience.
Carlene, do you want to read that next question?
Okay, let's see. Hi, this is kind of a question, but more of an observation. I hope our speakers will reflect on one theme I've seen repeated across a few different narratives of the last year's activism in the movement for Black Lives was that a lot of people were more motivated by opposition to Trump than the Black Lives Matter movement. Professor Gordon's comment about our intentions and the need to act out of radical love and not reproduction of the self brought this to mind. I am curious whether our panelists have observed this dynamic and whether they have any thoughts for countering it and motivating our communities to continue to engage in the necessary work and activism.
Is there another one?
Those are the only two. They're quite robust.
What should we be doing in higher education?
Carlene, did you want to add your own question?
What should we be doing in higher education? That was just.
Oh, okay, great.
Well, my immediate thought on this one is very straightforward. One of the reasons I brought up this point about radical love is it requires not making your ego the obstacle, right? The all about me stuff. You ever notice, for instance, whenever there's a Black or a brown person talking about racism, there's always a white person who's more obsessed with whether they're not racist than dealing with racism, right? And so suppose at the end of the day, fine, you get a Black person or a brown person to say you're not racist. You go home, but the world stays the same. Doesn't do anything. That's why it's important to get to the political issue. But here's the other part. The problem with that model is that's the narcissistic model. You see, when you're fighting for what's right, Simone Weil had a beautiful way of referring to this. She had a concept she called the decreation of the ego. She called it decreation. She argues that, you know the expression to be full of yourself? Mm-hmm. She says the problem when we're full of ourselves is there's no room for others. But a social problem requires others, you see? That's how we address it. So once you decreate your ego, then you understand that others have a right to criticize you. It might make you be able to do something that can make things work. If we put it from race to gender, if there's a male who's involved in fighting against misogyny, he has to face the fact that he won't always do it right. And it would be important for a woman to say, yo, You're not doing it right. You're doing something wrong. And at that moment, it's a simple response, sorry. And you work together to do it right. So I think the issue is less about for whites to worry so much about whether they are white and worry more about the power linked to being white. I usually put it this way. When Audre Lorde says the master's tool, right, doesn't tear down a master's house, most people are still obsessed with tearing down a master's house. But what they don't think about is what happens if you build better and other houses. Then that house becomes irrelevant. That's a boring house. It loses its power. The biggest fear of racism is to become irrelevant. It becomes irrelevant when power is distributed in a society. That's why democracy is so important here. And so I would argue that the more we build democratic institutions, and I don't mean democratic institutions in the form of just voting, because that's a consumer model. Democratic institutions of ongoing civic practices for a decent society that treats people well. Okay? That at that point, nobody's noticing you're white because there are just so many good things happening. And at the end of the day, the other part that folks really forget is that, you know, the way we think of ourselves today isn't the end of the story. If we understand ourselves as relationships, the new relationships we build are going to create new kinds of people. And those people will face different challenges, but we hope our actions would be such that the challenges they face will make them look back at us and say, thank God they acted. But I think Yolanda wants to say something there, so I'll stop here.
Please, Yolanda, and if you just excuse me for 1 second, there's one more question in the chat, so I'll just read it quickly and then to consider with the others. This is from OJ Marty. What gives you hope as a person of color new to this community? I find myself actively looking for people, places, moments that give me life and hope. Can you reflect on this, Yolanda?
I'll try to, I've heard all of the questions and I will, you know, kind of try to do a wrap up and pull some things together. And one of the things that Lewis said that I would like to kind of pull into, you know, and expand a little bit more upon is this idea of power and disseminating power. And I want all of us to keep in mind that race is a construct. It's something that has been created. It's something that is used in order to separate people and divide them. And so I think we have a tremendous opportunity ahead of us to reimagine what it looks like to actually empower people and to make sure that there's this centrality around radical love. I love that terminology around radical love, and it's here. Here's our opportunity to do it, and I will bring in the power of young people in our community and how important it is for us to make sure that they are front and center in the conversations and their voices are being heard. Their voices are powerful. I used to run a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. called Operation Understanding D.C. And so I worked directly with young people. And I have to tell you, I learned so much from them, and I continue to seek them out all the time because they are coming to the table with a different philosophy and a different mindset around how we liberate people, how we dismantle these systems. And so I just want us to think about, you know, with that practical lens, that is definitely one of the ways that we are going to change this narrative. And it's about changing the narrative. It's not about getting on the field and playing the same game and trying to play it differently. It's about totally shifting our, you know, having a paradigm shift. We don't even have to play a game. We can do something different. This is, you know, the urgency of now is upon us to rethink how we are going to approach making the world better for everyone through that lens of radical love.
Well, thank you for those summary thoughts. It is 8:17 and we are a little over time. I have one final question, and maybe those who need to go can, but it's great that everyone's still here. Maybe we can take a few more minutes. As you've both been talking about relationships and inclusivity through radical love requires it. I keep thinking about the ways in which identity politics have been really an important response, starting with the Black feminists and in response to exclusion. But in part, what's happened with identity politics, and I'm thinking ahead, I'm thinking about how we teach our children, and thinking about the children of our congregations, endowing them with a sense of a rich past that has many channels, many pathways that become intertwined, a sense of themselves, a sense of their history, but also how their history is part of other histories. How do we encourage a sense of identity and connection with the past without becoming mired down in a kind of nationalism of identity, a kind of bounded identity, so that we reduce identity and it becomes a boundary instead of an openness to radical love?
Well, you know, radical love starts with a basic insight, which is that every human being has the ability to love that which is radically different than a human being. All right? I talked about the trees. We can love animals, but also when it comes to each other, fellow human beings. You see, when you constrain another human being to be like you, you're blocking off the other human being's potential for freedom. But when you can love through freedom, it's an elation in the possibilities of others. And the point you're making right now connects to the earlier question about higher education. Well, this is something that I spent a lot of time on, not only building departments, but I've built educational institutions as well. And one of the things I've always discussed with when we're working together to build them is that we would like them not to constrain the future, but to open it, which means that we should not become imitations of the past. We just need to remember the past. This is crucial because you see, you know, the way I talked about liberation and those other elements before, it's also important how we think about what a human being is. A human being is not a thing. The problem when we think of human beings as things is we think of human beings almost like pebbles you put into a vase. Or if you think of the game analogy, you think that you can keep the game, you just have to change the players. And that's connected to you see, what people call identity politics actually isn't politics. It's identity moralism. Because you see, politics, properly speaking, must change the game. But if we're going to, one big problem why we tend to be locked in a cycle is because quite often in trying to squeeze people into the game, we never question whether the game itself is unjust. And there's another problem when we try to squeeze people into the game. If the game is actually what's producing how we understand of people, then if they don't fit in the game, we say there's something wrong with the people. When all along, there's something wrong with a society that makes people into problems instead of addressing the problems people face. So if we understand things as about changing the game, and we understand that in changing the game, it changes us, then I have argued, and and there, we go back and forth, I go back and forth many about this, is that sometimes we worry too much about whether we can retain ourselves. If we don't have this openness where we are both connected and changing at the same time, we will cease to be human. And part of this, if we want, one of the reasons that when I was talking about politics, I didn't bring up identity when I talked about it, because I see the focus as making a distinction between choices and options. If you limit the options people have, the only choices remaining are going to be inward directed. And that's why we get into this identity cycle. But if we can increase the options available to people, then the choices they make can be more meaningful because they're now outside, they're intersubjective, they're communicative, they're part of the world, of each other. In other words, when we're in a healthy human context, every moment is actually, in the good sense, a question in the form of a possibility. But when we face a kind of closure, right, identity closure, to know a person's identities, to know all you need to know, nothing more, then that leads to a form of situation in which the only thing left is an internal circular inwardness, which is one of the reasons why there's so much neurosis and so much suffering in oppressive societies. So at the education level, it's very straightforward. We need to begin to build non-idolatrous disciplines and ways of learning. We need to bring humility in how we relate to each other as co-learners. To give you an example, when I teach, I always open with saying, I always ask my students, what is a professor and what's a student? And students always think professors are Moses with the tablets. And I have to explain, no. The way I see a professor is as somebody who fell in love with learning and continue to learn. And all a student is a beginning learner. But because no two human beings have the exact same experience, the new learner is always bringing something to the experience of learning, which is why every teacher always learns from her or his or their students. And I'll give one last metaphor. I'm also a jazz musician. And one of the cool things about jazz is you can just assemble a group of jazz musicians, don't tell them what's being performed, count off, and we can play. How is that possible? Everything we've learned about society says that's not possible, but jazz musicians do it all the time. Well, the answer is straightforward. We can do it because when we count off, every one of us listens. And when someone performs, each of us is committed to the music happening, which means we do our best to enable each performer to do her or his best. Could you imagine what our society would be like if instead of sticking out a foot to trip people over and blocking people and all that, instead of having envy and jealousy and those things, we see ourselves as part of a project of facilitating every other human being's flourishing? Boy, we'd have a grooving society.
That is certainly an ideal to strive for, and there have been societies around the world that have cultivated that ethic. I don't want to be trite.
No, I understand.
And wrap it up. So quickly, I'd like to invite Yolanda for a closing word, and Wendy or Carleen to read up the final comment, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
Yeah, I tell you, I was just listening to Lewis and I was lost in dreaming about a world that could be that way. And I don't have much more to add. I will just say that with education comes so many opportunities and possibilities. And we want to look at the beauty and the possibilities of what can be, and not the barriers and this kind of fear that can come along with really opening our brains and our hearts and our spirits and our souls to learning about the intimacy of the human connection.
Thank you. Very positive. Wendy, Carlene, there's a last reflection.
Okay, Carlene's asked me to read. Okay, the last reflection. As a mom, it is a daily act to practice radical love. I realize the times that I am not radically loving my son is because I don't like the thing he is doing or interested in. This is narcissistic love. What I want him to do gets in the way of seeing him. Then I go to bed and reflect on the day, and I can either be upset at myself or I can be upset and then have compassion for myself and say, okay, Amy, this is hard. You can do it. He is growing into his own person. See that? Let him know you see him and want to understand him. So much more here. I think this is very connected with what we are talking about.
Absolutely. That is a wonderful way to end, to bring that internal, the external that we've experienced to the internal, and for us to then close on that note and to thank so much everybody who's joined us and our wonderful panelists for helping us frame some of the issues and thoughts, ideals, directions for how we want to center Black Lives Matter and its radical inclusivity for moving forward in our congregation and our communities, and thinking about what is next as the first in this three-part series. Thank you so much for your time, Louis, Yolanda, Marco, who had to leave. We very much appreciate your caring thoughts and deepening on our understanding today. I want to ask if you're okay for our participants to send you follow-up emails or questions if they continue to have some thoughts that they didn't have a chance to share here. And we're getting wonderful thanks and responses in the chat. Have a wonderful evening, all. Thank you for joining us. And as we do in the Trinidadian community I work with, as an Indigenous, goodbye. Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
And
you to
I'll
Wendy.
welcome